Have you ever looked at the columns on a building and wondered where that design came from? And what about the scrolly, fancy decorative bit at the top? What's that all about? From ancient temples to modern porches, columns have been a symbol of strength, beauty, and power for thousands of years, and we still see them everywhere today, especially on iconic buildings such as the US Capitol, the New York Stock Exchange, and the White House, where their classical elegance conveys power and permanence. In this video on Homes Explained, we'll explore the origins of columns and capitals, break down the classical orders, and look at how this ancient architectural language continues to shape the homes and buildings around us. Columns date back to ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, but the versions we're more familiar with were actually developed in Greece and Rome. They were originally structural, supporting temples and civic buildings, but they quickly became very symbolic too, representing the ideals of harmony, reason, and authority. The Greeks favoured proportion and clarity, and the Romans adapted these ideas, adding drama and scale. This leads to what we now know as the classical orders, a design system that dictated everything from a column shape to its ornamentation, all based on strict rules of symmetry and proportion. We all know the column as the long, tall, vertical shaft, but lesser known is the capital, which sits on top. This is the decorative flourish, which is the kind of transitional element between the vertical shaft and whatever sits on top. And the capital is the easiest way to recognize which classical order the column belongs to. But some are simple, some are very ornate. Whatever design it is, each one is fundamental in the building's storytelling and engineering. So let's go through the main classical orders, starting with the simplest and working up to the most decorative. So first up is the Tuscan, which is Roman. This one has a plain shaft, which is typically smooth, an unadorned base and capital. And it's often used in utilitarian or very restrained buildings. Next up is the Doric, which is Greek. This is very sturdy and it has a fluted shaft with a plain rounded capital. It's fairly masculine and weighty looking, and it's used in temples like the Parthenon. The Ionic is also Greek. It's slender with a fluted column and scroll-shaped volutes on the capital. It's very elegant and balanced, and the volutes are those kind of distinctive spiral scrolls. They remind me of kind of like a ram's horn, and it's one of the most recognizable motifs in classical design. Its form has been echoed across centuries, not just in columns, but in staircase banisters, furniture legs, and decorative brackets. And if you're from the UK, the volutes always remind me of a walnut whip, you know, that kind of ever decreasing circle. And I haven't had one of those for years. And if they're still around, filled with yummy marshmallow, please let me know. Next up, we have the Corinthian, which is a very slender and fluted column with an elaborate capital covered in carved acanthus leaves. Now, the acanthus was a very common Mediterranean plant, but in architecture, it became a symbol of endurance, rebirth, and immortality. Next up is the Composite, which is a Roman capital. It combines the volutes of the Ionic with the acanthus leaves of the Corinthian. And it's very ornate and elegant and often placed on tall fluted columns to create maximum visual impact. And it's funny with the Composite because whenever I'm looking at columns and trying to identify them kind of immediately, I have a panic when I see the Composite because I think, well, which one is it? It's got a little bit of everything. And that's the whole point. If it's got a little bit of everything on it, it's the Composite. The Palmiform is the only Egyptian capital in the classical order. These columns were shaped to represent palm fronds or lotus flowers and were common in ancient Egyptian temples, but they weren't just decorative. They carried symbolic meaning tied to fertility, renewal, and the divine. And with their broad, leafy capitals, they also give off a surprisingly tropical, almost Hawaiian feel. Or if you like this restaurant like I do, you may recognize them from Cheesecake Factory. And finally, we have the Solomonic column, which is a Baroque column. Now, this, just like the Palmiform, is not part of the traditional 5 orders of the classical order, but it is historically significant, which is why I wanted to include it. These spiral or twisted columns are full of movement and drama. They're often found in religious settings, especially in Baroque altarpieces and ecclesiastical architecture. Their dynamic upward motion draws the eye heavenward like a visual prayer carved in stone. So what do we mean when we say the word order? A classical order is more than just a column. It's a complete design system. It includes the column itself, the capital at the top, the base at the bottom, and the horizontal element called the entablature. Even the proportions of each part are carefully calculated. These weren't just traditions that were passed down, it was all actually written down. And the first known guide came from a Roman architect in the 1st century BC called Vitruvius. And he wrote a book called De Architectura. And later, during the Renaissance period, architects such as Palladio furthered the system even more by adding diagrams and measurements so that future architects and builders can really replicate the classical order with the correct precision and proportions. So when we talk about a column and capital being, Ionic or Doric, we're not just talking about a design style, we're talking about a whole architectural recipe. Each classical order traditionally has a matching shaft style. Doric, Ionic, Corinthian and Composite are always fluted. The grooves emphasize verticality and light play, while the Tuscan column is always smooth, just plain and simple. The Palmiform and Solomonic vary depending on era and interpretation, but typically highly sculpted and textured. A question I get asked quite a lot is, can you mix and match columns and capitals? And according to the classical architectural order, no. Each order is its own system, comprised of the shaft, the base, the capital, the entablature, all set to work as one unit. But in modern and postmodern design, obviously, there's a lot more freedom. You could have a Corinthian column on a smooth shaft. You could have a fluted column with a square capital. It's all about the look you're trying to achieve rather than trying to enforce some ancient rule book. So while the ancient world gave us fluting, volutes and carved foliage, the modern world has embraced clean lines and functional forms. But whether traditional or modern, columns continue to serve as visual anchors in architecture, quietly carrying the weight of the past into the present. So next time you pass a column, take a closer look. Is it fluted or smooth? Is it simple or sculpted? Each column has a story, and now you know how to read it. Thanks for watching. Please give this a like and subscribe, and don't forget to let me know in the comments which one's your favourite.